How does a songwriter like myself not favor a guy like David? When David ends his life and he sort of concludes, he doesn't call himself the giant slayer or the greatest king of two. He calls himself the sweet psalmist. That's the choice. That's the title he gives himself. It's like in the end of it all, it's kind of what he knew of himself. Of the 150 psalms we have recorded, 73 of them have his name to it. That's 49%. Interestingly enough, 52 of those 73 are in distress. I mean, 71% of the songs that David writes that are called psalms were while David was having a rough time. He is referred to 1,118 times in Scripture and 971 verses in 28 books. That's 42% of the books that are out there. Thank you. He is called as a teen, reigns for 40 years, and dies at 70. He has 7 brothers, 2 sisters. He's the youngest of 8 boys. He has 8 wives, 19 sons, 1 daughter. He's a busy guy. He writes 13 of those psalms. Those psalms are actually prayers. We read for what it's worth. 17, 86, 142, 4, 6, 39, 54, 55, 61, 69, 86, 141, 143, for what it's worth. 6 of them are called michtams. Think of it as a tattoo on your soul. 6 of them are contemplations. 2 of them are to bring you remembrance, and 2 of them are written to someone named Yeduthan. 8 of them are written to specific tunes, sort of common melodies. To be honest, the easiest place to pull something like that would be Ireland, where they used to have common melodies for which people would tell historical stories. 8 are written for specific instruments. David seems to favor stringed instruments, be that an instrument of gas, an 8-string harp, or stringed instruments in general. That's actually, for what it's worth, 6 of the 8. The other 2 are with flutes. Well, 1, I'm sorry. 53% of the ones he writes are to chief musicians. It's easy to overlook this unless you are one. What that tells me is that 53% of them are written to someone that's like the leader of a band, and it's going to be something congregational. 47% of them then, on the other hand, are written very intimately. As a stringed musician, it's easy to contextualize David as 53% of the songs that we have recorded in Scripture. We don't know how many he's actually written, just which ones make it onto the top 73. Are songs that he's written for the band to play in front of people, but maybe 47% of them were just him and on his harp, or if you will, him sitting alone with his guitar singing God. 14 of these psalms are subheaded. Means they give us some form of historical context. And let's just say it this way. His life was a symphony performed in 4 movements, 4 seasons. God says in 2 Samuel 7:8, and in 1 Chronicles 17, it's the first verse there. No, I'm sorry, it's verse 7. I took you from the sheepfold, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people Israel. As he's the youngest of 8 boys, and you're going to be a shepherd, the last place you want to be is behind the sheep. Do you know why you don't want to be behind the sheep? First of all, you have to be protecting them from what would come behind them, but also you have to be very careful where you step. You're walking behind sheep. He is introduced in the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verse 17, where we read that Ruth, the very one for which the book is named, is his great-grandmother. Those 4 seasons, the first of them, David the Reverend. And in each of these, I'll be giving us some form of historical context, and then I'll be challenging us to read around. Because of the sake of space, and you know we'll all need these, you'll have to realize it isn't like the next line down will be the next verse. So we'll stop at a place until you see the number, and then the next number will be the same as we would to read around. So let me explain our first of the 4 seasons. With each of them, there'll be a key moment, if you will, and a low point. if you will. The key point of this will be David's calling, called to be king. His low point, really, to be honest, we really don't have one in his first season. In chapter 13 of 1 Samuel, he is introduced, but not on stage yet, if you will, when God is actually warning Saul, the current king, and he says, the Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. Now, please understand, as a songwriter, and I've been a songwriter since about the age of about 6 or 7, you learn the what, maybe even the how, in the historical books like 1st, 2nd Samuel, the Chronicles, a little at the beginning of 1st Kings. But you learn the why in the songs. If you can listen to 5 songs by an artist and not learn anything about them, either you're not listening carefully or they're not being, in my opinion, you're not being very transparent in what they're writing. So we don't know the guy yet in chapter 13. If we've never read the Bible, all we know is there is a man. He's tall and good looking, and God said, I'm looking for someone else. And the man that I've found is a man, not what he's achieved, not in his performance, but it's what he's after. Please understand, that's huge. I can't read that and not pull myself aside for a second and go, what am I really after? I'm not just talking about what kind of looks important or how should I behave in front of you to give some form of example, or there should be, some standard of protocol. But what is it I really, really want? What's the one thing that my heart laces up to go after? When God looks, because he'll tell us when he's anointed, he's not looking at the outer appearance. That's man. We look at the outer appearance. It's all we can see. God says he looks at the lebav, the inside. That's why I always like to say, when someone's taking my picture, make sure you get my good side, my inside. God looks and he goes, you know what? This guy's really... I found somebody that's after he is chasing after my heart. Now think that through for a quick second. If you were after someone's heart, what would that look like? Let me just suggest this for the sake of time. You take that which was important to them and make it important to you. Yeah. And you take that which hurts them, threatens them, or worse, is at enmity with them, and you'd make it an enmity to you as well. I understand why God speaks of man, or David could say things like hating someone with a perfect hatred because of the war they've declared on God, and why God understands what he means by that. 2 chapters later, when God's handing his P45 to Saul, the current incumbent, he says this in chapter 15, verse 28. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. Who likes to hear those words? But because he's a neighbor, that limits down where it can come from. Because Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, then I have to look at the tribes that surround Benjamin. That's either Judah or Dan or Ephraim or Manasseh and the Jordan River. So, Saul knows he's being replaced. You have been dismissed. And he's got to find it from one of these 3, maybe 4 tribes. But if we were to take a little bit of his Psalms, and this is the fun for me, as I spend maybe a year pulling apart 73 Psalms, and just asking, some of them it's fairly easy because it's written in the context. Where do you think he wrote this? Where was he when he wrote this? But the first section is about a kid who's reverent. David's first season is David the Reverend. And I think it encompasses so much. Awestruck, wide-eyed, rolled over with wonder. I remember those days when I first accepted Jesus. Everything was astounding. And I read this and I realize God was the really, really, really big thing. So what's mine? Now, my past, my feelings, my hurt, my problems, my challenges. What's the really, really, really big thing? It's the foundation for a healthy fear. We're told to fear the Lord, not to tremble like the Wizard of Oz, but to recognize God as the really, really, really big thing. Because my relationship to the really, really, really big thing in my life will dictate exactly how I live my life. And if the really, really, really big thing, I'm not talking about idealistically, I mean practically in my own life, the thing that really is that big is the Lord. And I know His sentiment towards me. That's why I live the way I live. Because He's my really, really, really big thing. This is why Goliath was no formidable threat. He may have been really big, but he wasn't the really, really, really big thing. But men who revere the living God as the really, really, really big thing will not remain in obscurity for long. God comes calling. Let's look at it together. Perhaps a few psalms from a shepherd boy. Psalm 8. Do you see it there? The chief musician on an instrument of Gath, David speaking, saying, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who have set your glory above the heavens.
Out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants you have ordained strength, because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger.
When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you ordained.
What is man that you are mindful of him, and angels? No. And the Son of Man that you visit him.
You have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor.
You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet.
All sheep and oxen, even the beasts of the field,
the birds of the air and the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the seas.
Our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth.
Imagine being a kid, 13, 14 years old, laying in what we would call the 1,000-star hotel. That's outside. Looking up at the 1,000 stars and going, when I look up there and realize this is just the work of your hands, I feel so small. You are such the really, really, really big thing. And that is so cool. How excellent is your name. Psalm 19, verse 1. And you can start that one and kick us up. No? Okay, we'll go to Jonathan.
The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows His handiwork.
Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge.
There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard.
Their life has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them He has set a tabernacle for His Son.
Which is like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber. Which, by the way, you may be aware that's when He declares the purity of His bride. And this is a sunrise for Him. And rejoices like a strong man to run its race.
Its rising is from one end of heaven, and its circuit to the other end, and there is nothing hidden from his heat.
The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple.
The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the earth. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes.
The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether.
More to be desired are they than gold, yea, even more than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and honeycomb.
Moreover, by them your servant is warned, and in keeping them there is great reward.
Who can understand his errors? Cleanse me from secret faults.
Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless, and I shall be innocent of great transgression.
So, 14. Right? Let the words of my mouth and meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer.
Following the sheep, there you are, and the sun begins to rise. Now, your alarm has gone off. The pillow saying, don't go, don't go. Is the day heavy? Is the day burdensome? David would say, I see the sun rising, which until we moved farther north like this is rather early. And he goes, you know what it looks like to me? It looks like a day of purity, a day of hope,
Amen.
a day of victory.
Amen.
When that strong man comes out and he's like, yeah, not just a man to run his race, but a strong man, the favored one. It's when Usain Bolt steps out and everybody else is 4.5 feet tall. And he just kind of looks and he goes, I could do this backwards. Right? And everybody knows who's going to win this. We all know. And David looks and he looks at the sunrise and he goes, that's what the morning looks like.
Wow.
He goes, man, this, because he says, look at day after day and night after night, it's pouring forth speech and knowledge. Do you know what it's telling me? It's telling me this is what a day is like.
Wow.
Do you see reverence in that?
Yeah.
A guy that looks and says, God, you are such the big, big thing. What in the world should I be afraid of?
Amen.
Psalm 23, which we may be familiar with. But again, as a shepherd boy, look at what he does.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters.
He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake.
Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me.
You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over.
Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
David, as a shepherd, looks and he cares for his sheep, names them all by name. And as he is, there's a part of him that realizes David has a responsibility, but as he has a responsibility, he looks and he's like, this reminds me of God. He goes, the rod and the staff, neither one of those are appreciated by the sheep. Do you know what the rod's to do? It's to poke your butt to get you going. Do you know what the staff is for?
No.
It's to pull you back when you're straying. But neither of those things feel gentle when you are determined to do or not do what you're supposed to. And what he says is, I get it. I get when God's goading me and it doesn't feel good. It comforts me now. Because I realize he cares enough to attend to me when I'm not getting busy at it. And when he pulls me back and my neck hurts because he's yanking me back, and I'm like, no, that's really going to change my life. And he goes, I know, but no way that's good. And he's pulling you back, and you're like, no, this is the best thing ever. He goes, no, I'm pulling you back to the best thing ever, God's speaking. And you realize, and he goes, I think they comfort me.
Yes.
And then he goes, you prepare a table before me. And without developing all of this, as much as I'd love to, when you were invited into someone's house, you were invited into their family. That's why Peter had such a big deal when he stepped into Cornelius' house, as Pastor Dan has so eloquently told us. Because you are becoming part of a Gentile family. He says, imagine you walk into a house and the first thing you say is, I just want you all to know I'm actually not supposed to be here. This is actually against what I'm supposed to do. Yeah, that's going to make friends. Anyways, but they would take you into the one room without windows, and the idea of it was, is if an enemy showed up at your door, at their door, your enemy, they had to get through them to get to you. Because culturally, you ain't getting to them in my house without getting through me first. And what I love is that David says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. It isn't like you set the table and then go, oh, I didn't know you had any enemies. He's like there staring down the enemy going, how you like this now? This one's mine. And David goes, I know that feeling because I know how to do that with my sheep. I do like the fact he says, you make me lie down. For some of us, that's never fun. When God makes you lie down. But can you see how David starts his life as this reverent kid?
Yeah.
And that's really but that never has to die. It just matures. All right. Well, so the first of David's 4 seasons. David the what?
Reverend.
Okay, now, you've had your rehearsal. Let's all do it. David the what?
Reverend.
Excellent. Second one, David the runner.
All right. I cry out to the Lord.
Oh, not yet. But that's good, though. Well done. Be ready.
Okay.
Key moments. The high moments, sparing Saul twice. The low point, 16 months with the Philistines. Actually sounds kind of like a movie with Brad Pitt. 16 months with the Philistines. Well, there is a shifting that takes place. And it really starts with the fact that Saul's been fired, so he has to be replaced. And Samuel the prophet shows up, and he goes over to David's dad and says, hey, I've got some work to do here, and I need your sons. And how would you like to be the one? Dad calls 7 of the 8. You're the 8th. You're still there with the sheep. Now, we do read later that David will leave the sheep with servants, so it wasn't like David had to watch the sheep or they're not going to get watched. But, imagine Dad looks out and the 8 boys are there, and he's like, all right, the prophet's come because he's looking for an important son. 7 of you come with me, you say. Now, how do you feel about that? All right? And by the way, God does make careful mention that he lists the names of just 3 of them. I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
For what it's worth. I mean, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shema. Now, he looks at them, and they're all lined up, apparently, and he looks at the first one, and he has this look on his face like, surely this is the one. It's good looking, so forth. And God's like, nope.
No.
The Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outer appearance, but the Lord looks at the levav, the heart. So he kind of looks and he's like, no, you're not it. No, you're not it. And imagine, first of all, if you were like the 7th, not even the 8th, you were the 7th, you're like, what chance do I have? And he's like, nope. Nope to the 6 of them. And then the 7th, he's like, this is it, right? They're all the only ones. And he's like, do you have any others? How'd you like to be looked at? He's like, come on, you have to have more, right? He's like, well, I got one more, the youngest, but he's out with the sheep. He's like, oh, I'm not sitting down, so you bring him in. And when he brings him in, he's like, oh, you're the one. And I love this. And it says, remember, the Lord looks at the heart. Having a qualifying heart was not one without defect. It was not one that was spotless from any worldly pollution.
Yeah.
What made his heart a qualifying heart was what he was in pursuit of. Remember, that's what God said? He goes, what qualifies your heart is what you're really after. So, we do read this. He was ruddy, admoni. That just means he was reddish in whatever way. Was he ginger? Did he just have those plotchy cheeks? We don't know, but he was good looking with bright eyes. And the Lord said, get up. I'll anoint that one. So apparently somewhere he sat down, he came in, and sat down, he's like, oh, maybe, no, wait a minute, get up. He's like, I'm not gonna sit until he comes in. He's like, oh, wait, that's not the one, right? And he's like, no, get him up. It's okay. Yeah, you're the one. And he does. And it says Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the midst of his brothers. Now, is there anyone you can think of before this point that maybe might have had a rough time because all of his brothers were pretty much older than him? Yeah, kind of sounds a bit like him, doesn't it? Here's the best part. It says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward, but we don't read how. Now, obviously, in Saul's case, we do know it was all about prophecy. And by the way, it tends to be the sort of gift of choice in the Old Testament. And then Samuel leaves. He goes back to Ramah, where it came from, if you will. Now, so what does David do? Dad's like, all right, everyone, back to work. Your son's just been anointed king. In front of his, first of all, my first thought is, if I cared at all about David, by the way, David means beloved. It's a great name to have, you know? Yeah. I mean, I would start to think, man, I should probably watch him a little bit because 7 of his brothers just got dissed in front of him. And I mean, reading the story of Joseph, it didn't work out real well for him. So David is anointed king while another stubbornly sits on the throne that, mind you, isn't his. What would your family dynamic be like at this point? All of your brothers have been rejected in front of you, and you're anointed king in front of them, and then Dad just goes, now get back to the field and get back to work. I remember a story about Will Smith after he had won I think it was Pursuit of Happiness. I think he won the Oscar for that, if I remember correctly. Oh, wow, and he was pretty proud of himself for that, and he came home to his mother. Remember that story? He came home, and here he is. He's got this statue, and his mom says, go get some beans at the corner market. And he's like, Mom, I'm Will Smith. She goes, you're my son. Go get the beans. Will Smith had to put down his Oscar and go get the beans. Anyway, the whole point of it is you might have been anointed king, but you're still a boy here and get to work. And so here's the best part. So I do love this. While that happens, we know that a tumultuous, tormented spirit comes upon Saul. Saul's in a lot of grief. And as it's the case, he's like, man, what do I do? And one of his servants say, look, I've seen this son of Jesse. He's a Bethlehemite. He's skillful in playing. Because they're like, you know what you really need is you need some soothing, smooth jazz. That's what you really need at a moment like that. We need somebody skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor. He's a man of war. Twice they use the term man. Prudent in speech and a handsome person. And the Lord is with him. Now, I remind you, God has already told Saul, a neighbor who's better than you are. And he's after my heart. But Saul, at this particular moment, he's having a rough spot, and he could really use someone to serve him. He's introduced to Saul as talented, brave, mighty, eloquent, and good-looking, and walks with God. And then, let's put things back into David's perspective. David got anointed king, Saul left, and everyone's kind of like, okay, that was weird. Samuel left. And there's David with his family. Okay, that was weird. And they're like, get back to work. And I do like this. When God calls you but doesn't necessarily deploy you yet, what do? You do what you do. Do what you've been doing until God puts you into practice. So he goes back into the field. And one day, imagine what this would be like. We don't read what the situation is, so we have to create one, but it's easy as good enough. So imagine they're sitting around the dinner table, and there's a knock at the door. And by this point, the brothers were like, did you hire a guy to come in here and play Samuel? What was all about it? You're just trying to look important, right? That kind of thing. And he's like, you're going to ever end up in the palace. You're like, right, yeah, okay, everyone bow down to King Little Davy. And all of a sudden there's and then there's a knock at the door, and they're like, hey, Saul, the king, has called you, and you need to grab your guitar and get over to the palace. You got a gig. And imagine David at the moment, wouldn't you just want to go, however, off he goes. Wow. How weird would that be? And weirder yet, the king's kind of acting possessed. And it says that David came in and Saul loved him greatly. He had a really warm welcome. And he says, please let David stand before me. He's found favor in my sight. And anytime things get rough, I'm calling this boy in to play his Kenny G for me or whatever. Look at before Goliath, all of David's great giftings, I remind you, the Holy Spirit's been upon him from this point forward. All of David's giftings served Saul personally. So there was no need to compare. Saul was benefiting from all the things that David had up to this point. And when Saul was in need, David helped him meet that need. Saul seemed to love him for that. The same way you might love like one of those massage arm things because it just serves you so well. But David goes from the shift to the shaft, and he loses favor with the impenitent. In chapter 17, we have the story of Goliath. 3 of those brothers are named. Remember the 3 that were listed at the beginning? When a person commits a crime, and then they make the news, what circumstance surrounding them would keep them from telling you their name? Their age. Interesting. 3 of them were mentioned when they were brought in, though all 7 were brought in before David. 3 of them, and only 3 of them, are actually in the army. What does that tell me? Well, according to Numbers 1:3, you have to be 20 years old or older. So let's just do the math for a second, because we do not actually read that Jesse had a multiplicity of wives. So, you got 8. First of all, some of you are thinking, like, that's going to happen. Right? 3 of them are 20 years old or older. You're with me. So count backwards now. 19, 18, 17, 16, 15. Unless something's really unusual, a couple are twins or whatever, David was likely about 15 years old.
Oh, wow.
And there's something else that will help contribute to that mindset. But I'd like you to remember that God said, I've sought a man. And they're like, we found this man. He's a mighty man of valor. He's a man of war. And his voice hasn't fully changed. He might have acne at this particular moment. He might be like wanting to dress in like girls' jeans at this point. All of that to say, that he's like 15 years old. He's not old enough to do he could barely watch a 15 film. Yeah. And so it's like Saul's problems have been manifesting in context privately, but Goliath turns out to be a greater problem than anything that Saul's had privately as far as publicly. Here's the best part about it, I realize. Up to this point, those Saul's issues are huge. He's trying to keep them private. But what Goliath does is takes Saul's greatest strength, his height, and it turns it into a public shortcoming. He's nothing compared to Goliath. David's strength, on the other hand, is starting to rise up because his strength is his reliance in the living God. Saul's benefits are quickly shriveling while David's are only getting started. So David says, as he shows up bringing cheese and bread. Now, I'll have to be careful I say this, but I don't know about giving a bunch of soldiers all blocks of cheese. What do I know? Maybe it just... Anyways. And David hears this giant guy ranting off on the other side, saying, come on, why do we all need to kill each other? Let's do this like civilized people. I'll go on my side, gigantic guy that I am. You bring one guy, and then when I kill him, you all can serve me. And David says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Oh, my goodness. And then they're like, well, news is caught up with Saul, and Saul brings this kid in. Now, I wonder, does he recognize him? He's like, dude, you're like the musician I bring in when I'm having a rough time. Right? Would that be weird?
It's so bad.
Or was it like Saul's in such a bad place he doesn't even recognize him? Is he like, no, He's like, have we met each other? Kinda. And he says, you really want to take on this guy? And he says, listen. And I love this. Listen, he goes, this is a challenge that for you, what's the biggest thing you think to Saul? I can tell you, I'm confident I know, at least in my opinion, what it is. to me, the biggest thing to Saul, the really, really, really big thing, is himself.
Yeah.
That's why Goliath is such a threat.
Yeah.
Because Goliath is bigger than his really, really, really big thing. Does that make sense? David, on the other hand, he looks at his really, really big thing, and then he looks at Goliath, and he's like, and I love this. In such a case, you know what he does? He reviews God's victories in his life. He's like, you know what? Your boy here took on a lion when it went after the sheep. And that's why I'm convinced David must have already written, the Lord is my shepherd. Because he's my shepherd, I know how to guard the sheep. Yeah. A lion came, Holmes, and I took that thing, it's done. Yeah. And then a bear came. At this point, you start thinking he's 15, he's making this up. Yeah. And he goes, the same Lord who delivered me from the paw of those two is going to deliver me from this paw. Yeah. Samuel's like, okay. Saul, sorry, he says, yeah, thank you. Okay. It's like, look he's defied the armies of the living God. He's like, pitiful. They've got a dead God.
Oh, yeah.
People are like, could you really think David could kill a giant guy like that with a stone? First of all, when a boy talks like that, giving glory to God, he could have killed him with a marshmallow. God's like, that's my boy, watch this. And by the way, what we'll learn, by the way, is that he doesn't even kill him with it. All he does is knock him down. What actually kills Goliath?
The phone?
His own sword.
Oh, his own sword. It falls on it.
You know, so it's like, he just knock him down, and there he is. And David's like, thank you very much. Oh, that's it. David, when faced with a challenge, reviews his previous challengers and that have perished when the Lord has stepped in. He won't wear Saul's armor because it has no history with him. And I like that. It's like, I already know how the Lord brings victory in my life. I don't need your program. I need the Lord in this. Yes, battles are going to move us forward by forcing us to rely on how we were victorious in the Lord before. Strangely enough, the way that battles bring us forward is by forcing us to review how we've gotten victory before this with the Lord. Some are searching for a new champion, but the Ancient of Days is undefeated, has no problem adding to his repertoire the more recent victories. But then, in verse 42 of that chapter, chapter 17, when the Philistines saw David, he disdained him. Listen, because he was only a youth. The term is na'ar. Does that sound familiar? If anyone was around last week, remember when Samuel was just a boy? Yeah. And the term was na'ar, which means from infancy to adolescence. Oh. Now, it doesn't say he viewed him that way. He appraised him as that. The Bible says he disdained him because he was that. Yeah. David, at oldest, was in adolescence. Wow. Fits with the numbers we were already crunching about age here. Oh, by the way, he was also ruddy and good looking. And apparently, Goliath wasn't really happy about that. But I guess if you're over 10 feet tall, you probably don't get asked out to the dance that much. That guy steps on your foot, you are gonna know it. There's a club called the Tree Club. Have you heard this? It's like everyone's like over 6'2" or 6'3" or whatever.
Oh, tree.
Yeah. And he says, look, you come at me with sword and spear and javelin. David is not unaware of the man's weapons. He goes, but let me tell you mine. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. Mm-hmm. He doesn't say, but I come at you with my cool little slingy thingy and a handful of stones. You come at me with those things, check out what I got, Holmes. He doesn't. He goes, look, my weapon's the name of the Lord of hosts. Mm-hmm. And then when the whole thing is done and Goliath is slain, Abner, for what it's worth, who, by the way, I love Abner because we tend to read often Abner the son of Ner, but Abner means Ner is my dad. So Ner is my dad, the son of Ner. Yeah, got that. Saul asks, so who's this kid? Who's his parentage? Hello, he's your musician. Remember that guy? Yeah, okay. And so why does he need to know his family? For two reasons. Well, one is because that family gets tax exemption, tax immunity, because whoever kills Goliath got that. But second, to see if he's a neighbor. The truth be told, he's a neighbor. Mm-hmm. When does the penny drop? Okay, I'll pick it up here, because this is all our transition. The next chapter, the son, the song, and the daughter. His son, Jonathan, loves David, so what does he do? He gives him his armor and the only other sword in the kingdom. Interesting for what that's worth, because that means he's declared him as the successor to Saul. Your own son says, Dad, you're not king anymore. This guy is. That's got to be rough. Then there's that song. Remember the one that hit the top 10 everywhere, including the Philistine charts? David is slain his tens of thousands, only Saul's measly thousands. The song takes a vulnerable, self-centered man and shows him that he's less. And I read you, God says, I found someone better than you. It's actually, every time he turns on the radio, it's right there, man. Saul is slain his, oh, God! It's like when Shake It Off was on. It was like, it didn't matter where you were. Babies would whistle it. Now Saul's got a problem, because either he needs to submit or he wants to kill. Does this sound familiar? Because this is all prepping us for Jesus, you know. So what happens? David comes, Saul's having a bad day, and David's still there. Though he's been anointed king, though he's clearly shown as the conquering guy in the Goliath account, though he's clearly seeing his tens of thousands compared to Saul's thousands, which would be great if it wasn't for the 10,000s guy. You know, now he still has to go back to his day job, which is playing for a very agitated Saul. So he does, and it says, by the way, Saul cast his spear and he said, I will pin David to the wall. I think it's interesting that he even says it. So David's starting to sing, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I'll pin David to the wall. I mean, at least you were warned, I guess. And it says David escaped his presence twice. So then that means is you ran from the spear. One of Saul's servants, picked up the spear, gave it back to Saul, and then brought you back in. And you played, and he threw it at you again. You're like, if you want a different song, just tell me. The ironic thing is it doesn't say David was afraid of Saul, but it does say that Saul was afraid of David. Wow. Interestingly, the guy throwing the spear is actually the guy that's afraid.
Wow.
Huh. Do you think that maybe Saul saw on David what had once been upon him? Yeah. So he's like, oh, but then not only does his son love him, and not only do like the songwriters love him, but his own daughter loves him, Michal. And I don't know his relationship with Michal, but it doesn't sound like a good one. He's like, oh, awesome, she loves him. She'll be a snare to him. What the dad says about his daughter? Oh, so good that she likes him. This will take him down. The people love David. The army loves David. The servants respect David. His son loves David. His daughter loves David. The only person who doesn't seem to love David at this point is David's boss, Saul. And I do think about this as I'm walking and praying. All those people may love David, but Saul's sentiments have clearly shifted. If David's eyes are off the Lord for a moment, that will be the only thing that matters. Think about that in your own life. Everyone loves you, but one person shifts on you. If your eyes are off the Lord, isn't that the person you walk around with that day in your own heart and mind? And you're like, what did I do? Here's the crazy thing. David's life was peaceful. I mean, well, it couldn't have been that peaceful. He took down a bear and a lion. But for the most part, it's like it didn't really get flipped upside down, so to speak, until God came calling. An interesting thought. But up to this point, Saul's spear rage, if you will, has been the product of a couple isolated fits of rage while he was unsettled in spirit. It hasn't been a declaration of war, if you think about it, except maybe until now. So the next chapter, Dad's like, we need to kill him. His son John intervenes. He says, don't do that, Dad. What's wrong with you? This guy is faithful and decent to you. So he's like, oh, you're right. Talk sense into me. Thanks, son. And he brings him back. And then what happens? That doesn't last long, and ultimately he goes into rage, and David's on his way off again. And so he sends a bunch of people to kill him. Oh. And then everyone that comes to get him prophesies. I do think that's an interesting thought. Dad, imagine being Jonathan. Dad's more than just moody. Again, he's dangerous when he's moody. He's determined now. This is more than a part-time problem, David. Seems more than just falling out of favor slightly here and there. That spirit troubling him, man. It says that he threw the spirit, and this would be a third time, and it says that the spear stuck in the wall. Now, what would the wall be made of?
I don't know.
It'd be stone, at kindest cedar wood, which is a hard wood. You know how hard you have to throw anything to get stuck into something like that?
Yeah.
You ever think about that? You think, dang it. Saul was a big guy, I remind you. No. Ultimately, Saul goes to arrest him because everyone he sends starts to prophesy. But when Saul starts to prophesy, he doesn't just prophesy. Do you remember what happens when he gets there? He does something else. He strips naked. Now, that could just sound weird because of the fact that he's stripping naked. But what did he prophesy? You ever wonder if what he's prophesying is, I'm really not the king. I shouldn't be the king. I mean, if the king is removing his clothes, he's removing his kingly clothes while he's prophesying. I could see why people are saying, is Saul among the prophets? That's a really interesting moment there. How weird would that be? If David was roughly 15 when Goliath came, and he'll now run until he becomes king at 30, how many years does David spend running for his life? Simple math. David spent half of his life up to that point running for his life, playing Jason Bourne, if you will. David, let's say all was simple and easy before God came calling. But David is called to be a world changer in a world that has no interest in being changed. What should he expect would happen? So endure he must. Because he is slated to be a giant himself in the halls of faith. He just doesn't know it yet. So David leaves. His son, Saul's son, susses the situation out and gets a spear chucked at him. So he tells David, you need to get out. And he runs to at least 13 places in this season. Remember, the first was David the Reverend. What's the second? David the what?
The runner.
The runner. And the first place he goes is to Nob. Nob, by the way, happens to be where high priest Abiathar and his peeps are. And David runs in there. He's fleeing, and he's like, you know what? I'm on a secret mission. He's lying. I'm a secret mission from Saul. Do you have a weapon? You know, funny, we happen to have that sword of Goliath. Remember the one you ripped off Goliath's head with?
Yeah.
You need that? He's like, how about any food? He's like, well, we happen to have the table of showbread here, but, well, in fairness, I think I could bend the rules with this one with you, David. The bread's just been taken off. It's been replaced. So technically, it's not as perfect as it was before because it's off the table of showbread. I guess if your men have kept themselves from women, you can see David going, yeah, all the men that are with me are safe. Well, I guess I can give you this bread. He was like, well, thank you. And off he goes. But in there, amidst them, happens to be a guy named Doeg. Never trust a guy named Doeg. Who happens to be, if you will, an overseer of Saul's shepherds, his goods. And with that, he goes back and tells Saul. But David now has a sword. Now, David, if he's a little ruddy guy, and he's got Goliath's sword, that's my thought. My alarm goes off and thinks, that is he dragging this thing? I mean, all you have to do is chase that line where the sword is getting dragged. And really, he gets captured in Gath, and he writes there. He runs to the cave of Adullam. Now, I'd like you to this is where we get our first of these, of David the runner, the Psalms. This is where he writes a song. But I'd like you to kind of consider this. We're in Psalm 142 here. Can you see that? David's fleeing for his life. All of the government is after him at this point. And I remind you, David was a hero, except that the guy in charge of them, or what appears to be in charge of them, has recruited everyone to basically make David public enemy number one. And David now hides in a cave. And as he hides in a cave, he writes this beautiful song, Psalm 142. It's all you, Mari. Jump on that.
Is it 32?
No, 142.
142.
Under the runner. David.
Sorry. Oh, right. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, that one. I cry out to the Lord with my voice to the Lord I make my supplication.
Pour out my complaint before him, and declare before him my trouble.
When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then you knew my path, and the way in which I walked there secretly set a snare for me.
Look on my right hand and see, for there is no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul.
I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living.
Attend to my cry, for I am very low. Deliver me from my prosecutors, for they are stronger than I.
Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise your name. The righteous shall surround me, for you shall deal bountifully with me.
I love this. David is in a cave, and David is a human being with a lot of passion. So he says, nobody acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. Nobody cares for my soul. Bring it around a couple times. Find it interesting because this is what we read that takes place during that time. While David's in the cave of Adullam, his family shows up. And I love it. Imagine David's writing, nobody cares for my soul. And like he's hiding in a cave because he's afraid that any noise he hears is people trying to kill him. And all of a sudden you hear, Davy, it's your mother. I brought cookies. I'm still all alone. And it says, and all that were in distress and in debt and discontented showed up. Funny, David's hiding, and the only person who just doesn't seem to actually find Saul. Yeah. The only one who can't seem to find David is Saul, but everyone else seems to know, oh yeah, he's just in that cave over there, and it's like 400 guys show up. Do you think they met somewhere and it was like the discontented in debt group? And they're like, we need to find David so we can all show up there? Or did they all just sort of show up at this place? Like, you know, like you opened up something that had honey and a bunch of ants showed up. And it's like, and imagine David's like, nobody cares. And God's like, well, let's just show you how crazy that is as an idea. And imagine David's like, wow, my mom and dad are here. And you know what he says? He's like, you know what I need to do? I need to drop you off. And he drops them off in Moab. Why would David drop his parents off in Moab? Because Ruth was a Moabitess. That was great-grandma. So if you think about it, they have Moabite roots. So he's dropping them off. He's like, be safe there. He flees. The prophet Gad tells him to stop hanging in the stronghold. He goes to the forest of Haret. And when he goes to the forest of Haret, he learns something.
Yeah.
Saul had gone and interrogated that priest that gave him the bread and the sword. And he doesn't just kill the priest. He kills his whole family. 85 people. Well, almost his whole family. One guy escapes, a guy named Abiathar. And then Saul, just to make sure he could kind of complete the job, kills the entire town of Nob. And David catches wind of that. And when that happened, David writes another song. Psalm 52. Who starts that one?
Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The goodness of God endures continually.
Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor, working deceitfully.
You love evil more than good, lying rather than speaking righteousness. Selah.
You love all devouring words, you deceitful tongue.
God shall likewise destroy you forever. He shall take you away and pluck you out of your dwelling place and uproot you from the land of the living. Think about that. That's the idea of Selah.
The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him, saying,
Here is the man who did not make God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and strengthened himself in his wickedness.
But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever.
I will praise you forever because you have done it. And in the presence of your sons, I will wait and learn, for it is good.
Here's my question. Who's he writing this about? Is he?
Or maybe himself.
Who is the one who's lied in this situation?
No, he did.
He was the only one who lied in the situation. Remember, he lied to the priest and said, I'm on a secret mission. He's like, you love evil more than good, lying rather than speaking the truth. You realize people are going to look and go, this is what a guy looks like when he doesn't make God his Lord. He's like, God's going to rip you out, lying tongue. I can't help but look at this any other way, but he's like, but in the house of the Lord, I'm still a green olive tree. Because there's forgiveness and there's mercy there. I can't find a psalm where I think David has greater self-loathing than this one. He couldn't have written about Doeg. Doeg didn't lie. The only one, really, he goes, you know what, in it? I'm going to trust you, Lord. It's all I can do. But you know what? David will never do that again. No other time is he going to lie like that. In regards to, I'm on a secret mission and so forth. So then he goes, and what he hears about is the Philistines have attacked Keilah. And by the way, David goes, and him and his 600 men now, they've gone from 400 to 600. And he goes, you know what happens? They go and they rescue Keilah, and you know what happens? Keilah turns them in. They hand him over to Saul. David has to flee. He's like, dude, we just saved you guys. That's going to happen more than once. He goes to the mountains, the wilderness of Ziph, and when he does, Jonathan shows up and he goes, look, you need to know that you are going to be king. Even my dad knows that. And after all of that, we do know that twice David had the opportunity to kill Saul, and he doesn't. Now, with that, we get to our last psalm of this section, Psalm 57.
Yeah.
Set to do not destroy. In other words, that was a common song for which then people didn't actually sue for royalty copyright infringement. And it wasn't a thing back then. And so Michta means something, by the way, that will teach and should impact you for the rest of your life.
Wow.
And remember, David's interesting is David had the opportunity to kill Saul. He doesn't, but he still feels guilty for cutting off a part of his robe. So this is what he says in Psalm 57.
Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me. My soul trusts in you, and in the shadow of your wings I will make my refuge, until these calamities have passed by.
I will cry out to God Most High, to God who performs all things for me.
He shall send from heaven and save me. He reproaches the one who would swallow me up. Selah. God shall send forth his mercy and his truth.
My soul is among lions. I lie among the sons of men who are set on fire, whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue a sharp sword.
Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be above all the earth.
They have prepared a net for my steps. My soul is bowed down. They have dug a pit before me. In the midst of it, they themselves have fallen. Selah.
My heart is steadfast, O God. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and give praise.
Awake, my glory. Awake, lute and harp. I will awaken the dawn.
I will praise you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing to you among the nations.
For your mercy reaches unto the heavens, and your truth unto the clouds.
Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth.
You ever read some of David's Psalms and think this guy must be seriously bipolar? Because the first half of it's like, oh my God, I'm just life is all I'm going to, and then he's like, oh Lord, thank you, I'm going to praise you. You realize, I think if we were just more honest with ourselves, you realize we're all in those situations. We just get we get the privilege of being able to sit in a boat under the stream of David's heart and hear how David really freaks out.
Yeah.
Look at trust, faith, is exercised in those storms. But in the first part of it, you start being overtly aware of how big a storm is, but then you get reminded that the storm still isn't the really, really big thing.
Yeah.
Really, really big thing.
Yeah.
So ultimately,
Oh, please
God bless you. Have a good night. David will have another chance to kill him, but he doesn't. And understand, this is when David will say at the end of that one, the Lord delivered you into my hand today, but I will not stretch out my hand against the Lord anointed. The Lord repay everyone according to their righteousness in this. When David says, the Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, and you think, righteousness, that's the end of your life, David? Not a lot of righteousness. There's one season of his life he could look back at and say, this was done right. And that was David the runner. David could have stepped into this situation and took matters into his own hands And he could have alleviated the problem in front of him, but he didn't let God do it then. And he's like, yeah, David will say at the end of his life, and we'll get there. Now I have to really pick it up. But David would be like, look, my life's really been a mess. But at least I could look back at that season and go, that was something I really wanted to do wrong, but I didn't do wrong. Wouldn't it be great to have every season of your life like that? Yeah, but for David, that wasn't the case. David ultimately after that thinks, well, Saul's just going to kill me anyways, which tells us there is a lack of faith in there somewhere. In chapters 27 to 30, David spends 16 months away, and no Psalms are written during that time. When David, if you will, has a backslide into Philistine territory, we read no Psalms being written there. Ultimately, what happens, David has appeared to be on the Philistine side, but he's been raiding enemies of Israel until there comes a point where Israel's going to stand off against Philistines, and David's really put to the carpet on this. God kindly disqualifies David. The other guys are like, I don't trust him. This is a great place for David to kind of turn coat and go back to his old homies. And so with that, they send him back, and David and his men head back to the town that they had been given. And when they go back there, every family member had been taken hostage. And at that point, they want to kill David. They want to stone him. And we read that David strengthened himself in the Lord. And that becomes the point of David repenting. It won't be the only repenting in his life, but it is one. And when that happens, by the way, the word is chazak. It means to fasten or to grab a hold of or bind yourself to. That's the word for David strengthened himself in the Lord. David grabbed a hold of the Lord. They're like, let's kill David, because everyone's family members are gone. They came back, and your wives and all your children. And David said, oh God, I'm just going to cling to you because they're going to kill me anyways, and I might as well be good with you. And then ultimately they don't, and David's like, well, can we go and get our stuff back? And God's like, I'm going to give you everything back. Not just your family, but I'm going to give everything they took. Your flat screens, even like your cool little necklace that you kept in your room that no one knew about or whatever. Your diaries. Whatever the thing is in context. But in it, what happens, David goes, and everything comes back. And with that, David sends a gift over to the people of Judah and says, hey, we're cool, right? And that takes us to our third thing. Now, first one was David the Reverend. Then David the Runner. Okay, so how long would we say maybe, let's just go from age 0. How long was David, we could say, was the season of David the Reverend? 15. How about David the Runner? 15. Now we have David the Royal. He is anointed king by Judah at 30. David is, for what it's worth, David is only allowed to be, in essence, he's only going to be the king of Judah for 7.5 years. And he reigns for a total of 40. So how many years does he have all of the nation? 32.5, 33 years. Right. David hears, by the way, that Saul died in battle. So what does he do? The guy that tells him, who said actually he killed Saul, which appears not to be the case, but he was taking credit anyways, he has him executed, he mourns, he weeps, he fasts, and then he sings a really sad song called How the Mighty Have Fallen. Then David heads to Hebron. They actually anoint him king. And with that, then, David starts to... There's two things that David seems to do the moment that he actually is given any freedom. The first is that he tends to grab more land. He takes on the Philistines. I love this. When this guy... And I use this as an example, by the way, for guys when they should be funded in regards to, like occupational ministry. If they were given more time, would they go on the offense? When David had more time, what he did? He went on the offense. But not only did he increase the territory, he also increased his family. And what we read about are 6 more sons by 6 more wives that David had. Now, God is not endorsing that. Well, what's clear is David's growing in a whole lot of ways. Ultimately, Saul's commander has a falling out, by the way, with the guy that they're trying to actually have replace Saul. His name is Ishbosheth. They're not trying to give things up quickly. By the way, over a concubine whose name actually means pavement. How would you like to be a concubine whose name is pavement? Seems almost redundant. And saying the same thing. Her name is Rizpah. And he has this great quote. Abner says, am I a dead dog that belongs to Judah? I'm so done with you. In other words, what happens? He joins David. But Joab, David's commander, doesn't trust him. So they go, hey, let's sit down and talk for a moment, and he kills him. kind of the way that works.
Oh, my thanks.
And David's like, I don't like that at all. When he hears about that, he curses Joab with this nugget. Let there never fail to be in the house of Joab one who has a discharge, or is a leper, or leans on a staff, or falls by the sword, or who lacks bread.
Wow, that's rough.
Who wants that said of them, especially by the king, right? But what the people do realize is that David wasn't behind killing the other guy. Ultimately, what happens, the rest of Israel cry uncle, and with that, Hiram will build him a house, the guy up north in Syria. And David realizes, wow, the Lord is really, he's done it. On your own, because I'll do this just for the sake of time and I want to be respectful, David will write, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? And he writes that, what's clear is, at a time when the Lord has conquered his enemies around him. He says, the wicked came against me to eat up my flesh and my foes, my enemies and my foes, they stumbled and they fell. That's what he gets out of that. David celebrates by getting more girls and having more boys. He centralizes the government to Jerusalem, going on the offensive, wants to bring the Ark of God into the capital. And ultimately, David will get there. It'll just take, he'll have literally a rough spot on the road to get there. And then David wants to build God a house. We're introduced to Nathan, who starts by actually failing. Isn't it great? That's how you're introduced in Scripture. He's like, David, sounds like a great idea. Go for it. And God's like, hey, Nate, that wasn't my idea. David's a man of blood. We're not going to build this on another man's blood like that. We'll build it on my own.
Aww.
So you go tell him. You're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you one. And with that, David doesn't respond with, oh, come on. He's like, wow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lord. Thank you very much. And what does David do as response? He goes on the offensive and gets more territory. When David is given a promise of God, he jumps to it. Now, we're at 3 of the 4. David first was David the
Reverend.
And then David the
Runner.
And then David the
Royal.
The royal. Now, 2 Samuel 10. King Nahash dies. Nahash means serpent, that should warn you. His son, Prince Hanun, ruling of the Amorites, takes over. David, in essence, sends sort of a flower basket. Really sorry to hear about your dad. The prince, now king, hears, oh, David's just spying. And the guys who went and brought this lovely little bouquet, one of the places you just can't make it up, shave off half their beard and cut their clothes off at the buttocks. And send them back to a place called Jericho, which, by the way, means its moon. Coincidence? I think not. David's like, then they realize they made themselves repulsive, and David's like, not going to fight this guy. I was trying to be nice to him, and look what he does. He sends me back like halter top boys, that are like half hipster and half Greek. And he's like, not going to fight him. So David goes to fight them, and at this point, the Ammonites realize, well, we're kind of outnumbered. So they hire Syrians, who always seem to be, for whatever reason, ready for a fight. They're like mercenaries for hire. And so they go in, but David, of course, conquers. But what happens is, interesting enough, it seems like they fight until the winter, and then the rain starts coming, and then they're like, all right, we're done. Most likely kill you in the spring, and then they just separate and wait. I guess who wants to fight in the rain? Which is why, of course, the Romans never really conquered London. What it's worth. But the stage is being set for David's big fall, and we don't even see it. Because David was part of that, but he was stepping back and letting his commander step forward. Interestingly enough, the one that he cursed with the discharge, lean on the staff, die by the sword thing, you had me at discharge. And I think about twice, Proverbs 6:10 and Proverbs 24:33, it says, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. And so shall poverty come upon you like a prowler, and your need like an armed man. You ever think about that from a spiritual perspective, spiritual laziness? What would it be like to just fold your hands and, I really don't need to invest spiritually at this point. In truth, the section of David's fall starts there. By chapter 11, it starts with this. Happened in the spring, round 2. At the time when the kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab. That should be enough for you to go, what, right? And his servants, and all Israel. It seems like everyone was there to fight except for one guy. The guy was supposed to lead them. David, we read, one evening, the word there is erev, it means dusk. David arose from his bed. Stop. Is that weird to any of you other than me? David's getting up and the sun's going down. Little nap in the afternoon, king. And that's when he sees the woman. David was always safer on the battlefield with the Lord than in the palace by himself. And then he says, who that? And his servants have to tell him, David isn't doing this alone. Now, let me tell you what it is. First, her name is Bathsheba. Bathsheba means daughter of a covenant. Strike one. Tell you something. She's the daughter of Eliam. Who's Eliam? Well, according to 2 Samuel 23:34, Eliam is the son of Ahithophel. That's David's closest counselor. So it's the granddaughter to your counselor, David. Strike two. And she is married. That should have been enough, but it's worse. She happens to be married to Uriah the Hittite. That's your bodyguard. Strike three. So let me see if I have this right. Her name is daughter of a covenant. She's the granddaughter to your chief counselor, your closest advisor. And the one guy that can get into your bedroom at night without anyone actually blinking an eye, who's always going to be armed when he does so, is his wife. Can you pick another pretty bathing girl somewhere than this? And I realized something in all of this. David's passions must be pointed and purposed, or they will have a fallout that will last a lifetime. And I am a person like David. I'm not saying that because of this story. It's a very dangerous point for me to say, to relate myself. But except this. I know what it's like to be passionate, and I know what it's like to be driven by passion, and if it doesn't have purpose, and it doesn't have a direction to it, it can do all kinds of damage.
I know.
And this is why it's so imperative for me to always be like, I want to have a purpose. I want to, all right, Lord, show me what I should be doing. Keep my eyes straight on the narrow.
Yeah.
Because in the end of it all, David kind of looks here and he is letting his passions drive. Which means he's driving blind. Now, ultimately, what do we know happens? David, it just gets worse and worse and worse. No, right. You know, when you're a kid, if you're one raised in a Christian home, you know what happens? You know, when you're 6 and you hear about David, you're like, yeah, David and Goliath. You hit about 15 and you're like, oh yeah, David and Bathsheba, right? I mean, that's the way it is. But ultimately, he doesn't just sleep with her. She gets pregnant. David, well, I mean, just look at the lineup. Clearly, he's got 19 kids by the time he's done. David's a pretty virile guy. And all of that, she turns out pregnant, which, by the way, you just don't know that the next day. How long did that last? And she's like, things haven't been good the last few months. What do you mean? Who wants to be part of that conversation? Oh. Well, let's bring your husband home so that he can think he did it. She's already got to be a few months pregnant to know this. Imagine he comes back from battle. He's like, honey, what you been eating? Oh, this is a food baby.
Oh.
You know those falafels. I mean, imagine. But this guy, here's the crazy part. He's such a noble man, this Uriah the Hittite. Hittite, by the way. Find that, by the way, when God talks about conquering the land, who a Hittite is. And with that, he goes, why don't you just go home? And I listen to this guy. He says to David, straight in his face, how can I sleep with my wife when all the men are in battle? Can you think David's like, I did? So he's like, and the guy won't. So he goes the Irish way. What's the Irish way? He gets them pickled. It's like, I remember in Ireland, like, you know what a man is after 4 drinks? I'm like, well, then you're never going to know who I am. Anyway. They get them pickled, and the guy still won't go in there. He's like, oh, you kidding me? So he has him killed. He sends the guy's so noble, he can trust him with his own death letter. He's like, take this and give it to the commander, Joab.
Oh my
Imagine that. Remember Joab, the one he's like, may you have a discharge and all of your family die by this, And so he's like, here. And it says he opens it, he's like, and imagine he's like, okay, go to the heat of the battle, and then everybody step back one, but don't tell Uriah. So he's like, yeah, guys. What a moment.
That's awful.
And Joab, by the way, knows he has the leniency now to do whatever he wants on the battle. He could be a madman. And he's like, oh, we won. We took all this stuff. We killed all these people. And we did it in ways you would never do it, David. But by the way, that little problem you had is taken care of.
Oh.
David's like, what? Oh, okay. Well, sword takes one. That's just the way. That's just all fair in love and war. Oh, that poor bride of his. That poor pregnant bride of Uriah. I'll marry her. And so he does. And God says, and God's like, this is not going to play.
No.
And I cannot not read these Psalms. Are you guys still with me? Because basically we have a couple Psalms to read and then we'll wrap this up. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And I do love the fact that what happens is, you're probably familiar with the story, the prophet comes with, in essence, a flannel gun. He comes in with a parable. It's like there's a guy, and interesting what he uses. Do you remember what the parable is about? A sheep. Now, why would that be so important to David?
He's a shepherd.
Back when David was David the Reverend, that was all about that. It's like there was this poor guy and he only had a sheep. By the way, apparently they didn't have that many because the brothers, when David went to see the battle with Goliath, they're like, who'd you leave those few little sheep with? So apparently it wasn't like he was Mr. Flocks. Hey, Floxy. So with that, one of these things, like there was this guy and he was like, he had one sheep and he gave it a name and it slept in bed with him. Not as weird as it sounds. Imagine back in those days if we said, there's this family and they have this dog and it sleeps in the bed with them. Those days, that would be the weirdest thing they ever heard because a dog was a vomit vacuum for them. They'd eat too much, they'd throw up, and they'd go, here, over, and the dog would clean it up. They were the Hoover of the day. So imagine.
In the 90s as well.
And the only reason I say that is how weird that would be. So they're like the guy had this thing was his pet, gave it a name, that whole thing, and ate at the table with him kind of thing. Then there was this rich guy, he had all that he wanted, and then anybody else had a friend show up and he killed the other guy's thing, and David said, what?
Oh.
And David, and you could tell, it's like, boy, the way it's easy to become unnerved when you've got a guilty conscience. And he says, that man must pay fourfold and die. Why is that so important? Because that is exactly the standard. Remember when we went through the Torah, when somebody steals an animal, is they have to pay fourfold. As a matter of fact, that goes beyond that. This is Exodus 22:1, for what's worth, if a man steals an ox or a sheep, or slaughters it or sells it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox, 4 sheep for a sheep. I think it's interesting, because remember when Zacchaeus, Jesus calls him out of the tree? Because I'm coming to your house today. He says, look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I've taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. See how that works? It's interesting. David says, I want the strong arm of the law and kill the guy. He's like, wow, well, interesting verdict for yourself. But you realize you're the guy. And David's like, oh no, dang it. He's like, I'll tell you what. Justice without mercy will be given to those who judge without mercy. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you mercy anyways, David. Look at, you are going to pay fourfold. But I'm not going to kill you. But you and I both know you deserve to die for this. Now, listen, and then we'll go to these Psalms. There's a vertical and a horizontal effect to everything we do. Vertical, our relationship with God. And guys, I can restore your relationship with me. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to have to still deal with it. The seeds you've sown on earth. His oldest son, by the way, will rape his half-sister. But before that, the child dies. That was Bathsheba's child. Then his oldest son will rape his half-sister. That half-sister's full brother, Absalom, will kill that other guy as a vengeance killing. And then he won't stop there. He'll try to take over the whole kingdom. That's the whole Absalom story. For which then he'll ultimately die for it. And even at David's end of his life, he has a son named Adoniah. who will seek to usurp the throne from his dad on his dad's dying bed. He pays fourfold for it. But that doesn't mean David doesn't know the forgiveness of God. Psalm 51, I'll read it out if you just humor me as I read Psalm 51 and then Psalm 32. Psalm 51 says this. It says, when the prophet came to David, he writes this song. Have mercy on me, O God. According to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you and you alone have I sinned. Now, wait a minute. Didn't you sin against Bathsheba and against your servants and against the kingdom? David isn't saying that he didn't hurt at other people. What he's saying is only God would call it a sin. In the sight of everyone else. I mean, he had servants. Which servant is going to go, David, that's not a good idea? Because against you, you were the only one who would still call it a sin. The world could have taken a vote and said, oh, we've decided that's not a sin anymore. God's like, I'm not changing my mind over this, David. So against you and you alone have I sinned and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak, Lord, and blameless when you judge. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. Behold, you desire truth in the inward parts. Remember that word? The lavav. And in the hidden part you will make known to me, you'll make me to know wisdom. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me to hear joy and gladness. Listen to this. Make me hear joy and gladness. It wasn't like joy and gladness wasn't taking place around him. He just couldn't hear it anymore. That the bones which you have broken may rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out my iniquity. And most of us are familiar with this. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a steadfast spirit within me. Don't cast me away from your presence. Remember, David saw that was Saul. And that did not look pretty, did it? And don't take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. And uphold me by your generous spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your way, and sinners will be converted to you. In other words, forgive me so I could teach people your forgiveness. Deliver me. By the way, don't miss that. David didn't just go, forgive me so I could feel better. It's like, I realize whatever you do to me should affect other people this way. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and uphold me with your generous spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will be converted to you. Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, O God, the God of my salvation, and my tongue shall sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall flow forth praise, your praise. You don't desire sacrifice, or else I would give it. You don't delight in burnt offering. The sacrifices of God, they're a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. Oh, these, O God, you don't despise. You will not despise. Do good and your good pleasure to Zion. Build the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will be pleased with the sacrifices of righteousness, with burnt offering and whole burnt offering. Then they shall offer bulls on your altar. He's like, look at, I've seen a man running from you who tried to offer sacrifices and you weren't interested because you're still looking at the insides. David's like, my insides suck. They're horrible. They're so nasty. And I need you to change them. Please, God. Please change them. Psalm 32. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Do you see that David knows God's forgiveness? Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, in whose spirit there is no deceit. When I kept silent, my bones grew old through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was turned into the drought of summer. Think about that. David's like, when I tried to run from you and tried to pretend like there was no sin in this, I got so old. Everything inside of me shriveled up and died. Remember when David said, make me hear joy? I acknowledged my sin to you. In my iniquity I have not hidden. Yes, I said I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Think about that. For this cause everyone who is godly shall pray to you in a time when you may be found. Surely in a flood of great waters they shall not come near him, because you're my hiding place. You preserve me from trouble. You shall surround me with songs of deliverance. Well, think about that. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will guide you with my eye. Don't be like the horse or like the mule, who have no understanding, which must be harnessed with bit and bridle, or they won't come near you. Realize what God's saying? He's like, God steps in and makes this a duet. He's like, don't be like a dumb animal, that the only way you'll ever come near is you have to be pulled. You know what's different? You have a will. Wouldn't it be great if you just chose to come near? Many sorrows shall be to the wicked, but he who trusts in the Lord, mercy shall surround him. Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, you righteous, and shout for joy, you upright in heart. What David learned was what it was like to be forgiven. It's interesting because I challenge you to look at the Romans text where it talks about the precedent of David, and it talks about what righteousness looks like. It's the righteousness of forgiveness, not a righteousness of your testimony. So David ends his life, and he says this for what it's worth, and I'm just capping it up because I'm just trying to be respectful of time. Psalm 37, verse 25, he says, I've been young, and I'm now old. David's 70 and he's old. I like that in this sense. He's still considerably older than I am now. Yet have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging bread. He's ever merciful, he lends, and his descendants are blessed. I like the fact that David would be able to say, I do know this. He's been faithful. But David, at his end statement, he says these are the last words of David in 2 Samuel 23. Interesting, because he does have later words to say, I think, to Solomon in chapter 2 of 1 Kings. And he's like, these are my last words. Open, Solomon. But maybe these are the last publics. He says, but he does say this thing, and it breaks my heart. In verse 5, he says, although my house is not with God, he has made me an everlasting covenant. David's like, for all this stuff that is so great, I have this regret. I like the fact he's like, my house is not yet with God. Listen, what starts as an expedition of wonder and amazement ends as a testimony of faithfulness and hope. That's what it means to mature in him. I never stop being amazed, but I'm able to tell you how he's been faithful. And the stuff that I don't see yet, I could have hope. Because I have all these experiences that I can see this. Such is the testimony of a walk of faith. I absolutely trust that the Lord is going to do fantastic things in London, and I absolutely trust he's going to do them with you. I have total faith in Pastor Daniel and Jaden, in Bruno, and the other men. And one of the reasons I have that faith is because I know who the really, really, really big thing is. In the end, God always remains the one really, really, really big thing. All Goliaths have fallen. All of his mistakes are forgiven, but not without pejorative cost. All enemies have been silenced. There is still trouble, but only one really, really, really big thing remains. And because he still remains and he never changes, I could really trust him with the rest. It's so out of my hands, it's never been in my hands. It's just going to be more clearly so here. And I want to pray for you. And I want to pray for me. Because you can go into a battlefield and get so comfortable in the battlefield, somehow you build a palace there. And we have watched giants slain. We have watched crazy giants slain here in this country. Some of them just us being able to stay. And there are more giants to slay, but they're not my rocks to throw. But that does not mean I'm stepping off the battlefield. To be honest, I just see other giants. They just happen to be in a different field. But you have giants to slay. But you don't slay them with your ox. You slay them in the name of the living God. And watch what God does. So listen. David the reverent. David the runner. David the royal. And then David the rebellious, repentant, and restored. David ends his life restored, but might I say as a caveat, with a regret. And the regret was the part of his rebellion. Here's the good news. Wouldn't it be great if you made the choices to never have that season? Pray with me, would you?